So, will you please welcome Jon Erickson.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for having us, and thank you all for coming out on a cold morning. So, Jim's given the talk. Any questions? I'm going to sort of go full circle back to where he has begun and bring it back to Vermont. But this is such an odd talk in so many ways because it's the thing that we know will make the most difference, but the thing we never talk about, right? This thing called economic growth. We know that if we dial it back, slow it down, maybe even go the other way, what we call degrowth, all the things that we want are possible. Yet we're so addicted to, dare I say, the religion of growth. Great place to talk about the religion of economics, my field. We're just... So I'm really excited to be invited to talk about challenging the so-called conventional wisdom that we can grow forever. Or challenging the wisdom that growth will solve the very problems that growth has created. Which is, as an ecological economist, has me scratching my head all the time. So, quickly, you know that we live in the Great Acceleration, right? So this sort of post-war period, you don't need to see the details of these graphs, just know that they all look like hockey sticks, right? On the left are the socioeconomic trends, population hockey stick, gross domestic product hockey stick, foreign direct investment, trade, all of these things, especially since World War II, are on steroids, okay? My parents were born in 1943 and 1944. In their lifetimes, okay, both still alive and well, in their lifetimes, global population has more than tripled, global gross domestic product has grown 12-fold, and foreign direct investment, the movement of capital all around the world, has grown a mind-boggling 18,000 plus times over. Just in my life, I just recently turned 50, and in my life, population has doubled, the economy has quadrupled, and global trade has grown by 10 times. And just in my life, we've lost half of all wild animals. Okay? So hockey sticks, right? On the left, socioeconomic trends, and on the right, the Earth system consequences, right? When we grow, so does carbon dioxide, so does nitrogen, right? So does loss of fresh water, so does loss of habitat, all of the things that Jim was referring to here in Vermont. We know that growth causes degradation and depletion. And so to stop degradation and depletion, guess what we do? We try to grow, right? So that we can afford something different. So I want to break my talk into two parts. Part one is this fairy tale of the Econocene. Okay, the Econocene is a phrase that one of my mentors, Richard Norgaard, uses a lot to talk about the reduction of all social relations to market logic, right? It's a cultural epoch, right? It's this time we live in, right, where the economic values economic values have completely pushed to the side all of our social values. As contrasted with the geological epoch that we often now call the Anthropocene, right? This geological era that geologists are claiming that we now live in of a human-dominated planet. One's a fairy tale, a story that we tell ourselves, and one is the reality of those hockey stick diagrams. So in part one, I want to take on the fairy tale that resource exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe, okay, which is the reigning logic in my field of economics. I want to take on the fairy tale that green growth, right, growing more efficiently, can actually solve some of these problems, and I want to focus on the climate crisis. Part two, in the realities of the Anthropocene, I want to use the word degrowth, right? Because we will degrow either by default or by design. And in my mind, the opportunity in places like Vermont is to lead by design, to show there is another way, right? To challenge the growth mindset, to wean ourselves from our growth addiction, and to design an economy and a society that takes back the values that we hold near and dear as humans. So let's start with that first fairy tale. This is from Robert Solow, 1973, the Robert Ely speech at the 86th annual of the American Economic Association. This is the annual speech of sort of the state of economics. Solow went on to win a Nobel Prize in 1987. He is sort of the father of modern growth theory, MIT professor, and he said, the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources, so that exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. Now, he said this kind of tongue-in-cheek to talk about the sort of assumptions that economists make about the growth model, right? That exhaustion is no big deal because we will forever and ever substitute away from the environment and towards human-made capital. So that exhaustion is just an event, but not a catastrophe. So let me back up. Here's why that statement is wrong. Here's why that statement is a fairy tale. Here's why the idea of resource exhaustion is not a catastrophe, both for us and for all the species that we share this planet with, is wrong. So in my world of ecological economics, we are obsessed with energy surplus, right? Energy surplus makes the world go round. Okay? The solar energy surplus, when we were hapless bands of hunter-gatherers roaming the planet, right? We lived off the solar surplus. When we settled down and we worked the land and we created civilizations and we created arts and economists and churches and religions and financial planners and every other career in the world except for agriculture runs on the agricultural surplus, right? Because when a farmer can feed him or herself and lots of other people, it makes everything else possible. So that's the ag surplus, which comes from the solar surplus, right? And then the real magic was these things called fossil fuels, right? Because it really allowed us to create the entire edifice of the modern economy because of the energy captured in this liquid magic, the fossil fuel surplus. Okay, that's what makes the economy run. 85% of the world's energy today comes from fossil fuels. This is the magic. This is why the growth miracle of the 1800s, the 1900s, the great acceleration of my parents' generation has occurred. This is what the economic system looks like. Okay? This is the model of how the economy runs. The economy takes energy and materials, uses them, whether it's products or services, doesn't matter, and out the other side comes energy and material, waste. Right? This is a figure, a very simple diagram that, unlike any diagram at the beginning of any introduction to economics books, actually obeys the laws of thermodynamics. Okay? This obeys the laws of physics, right? That first law that energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed, right? It doesn't go away when you use it. It becomes always and everywhere waste. And the second law says that things go from high usefulness to low usefulness, from low entropy to high entropy, right? This simple model obeys that. And that's the foundation of ecological economics. To simply take the box, the economy, and put it inside the circle. Okay? My whole career, just simply been that. No secret here. Put the box inside the circle, not the circle inside the box. Okay? This is ecological economics. So, as humanity has moved from human labor, human fuel, to human and animal and water fuel, water labor, hydropower, right? To fossil fuel, we have done this amazing thing of moving higher and higher up the ladder of what's called energy return on energy invested, EROI. Okay? This is a really wonky idea that is essential to how the economic model works. Energy return and energy invested. How much energy do you get? How much surplus do you get when you put a unit of energy in? Right? How much surplus do you get when you put a unit of energy in? If I put 1 unit of effort in to drill for oil, how many units do I get out? And those first oil wells in Pennsylvania were on the order of 150 to 200 to 1. Magic, right? 1 unit in, and then another 150 units out. Okay? The new oil wells that we are creating, or going back to the old oil wells and fracking and getting what's left, we're talking maybe 5 to 1. 1 unit in, 5 out. Right? The world average right now is 20 to 1, down from 100 to 1 100 years ago. This is magic, right? And that's where we've moved from human power to animal power to fossil power. We've climbed this energy return ladder, and it's made the modern system possible. And we are, in my generation, actually in my kids' generation, hit the peak of EROI and are on the downhill slide now. The surplus in a capitalistic system, this energy surplus, this ag surplus, this solar surplus, right, isn't stored for a rainy day. It's invested in new capacity through capital ownership to make more stuff, which ultimately consumes more energy. That's how capitalism works. It puts the energy surplus on steroids, right? And it creates the demand for future energy and future matter, so that this box inside the circle under the capitalistic system is expanding. Not into an empty world, but into a fuller and fuller and fuller world. Fuller of us. And as we've moved from local ecosystems to regional and bioregional systems to global ecosystems, the impacts of this box expanding into the circle have increased. The hockey stick diagrams, right? We don't grow the box into a void, right? Physics says that's just ain't so. We grow it into a fixed, finite planetary system that's open to energy, the sun, but closed to matter. Okay? That's the wonky part of this morning's chat on a cold Saturday morning in Vermont. So this is the system, right? This is the system that doesn't appear in introductory economics books, but is the starting point for ecological economics. So you say, okay, John, got you so far, I think. But we can kind of keep the growth machine going, right? The economy can grow without more resources or without more waste through, anyone know the answer? Efficiency, yes, efficiency, right? We can become more efficient per unit. We can create more stuff per unit of energy and matter over time, and less waste per unit of matter and energy over time, right? And that's how we keep the growth machine going. In fact, we have become more efficient over time. Per unit, okay? We've become more efficient per unit. We create more GDP. My generation creates more GDP than my parents' generation, than my grandparents' generation, per unit of oil, per unit of coal, per unit of sunshine, per unit of farmland. We've become more productive, is the word that's used, more efficient. However, this is what efficiency leads to. Efficiency doesn't lead to less consumption, it leads to more. Why? Well, look, in this graphic, the fuel-efficient car along the bottom has lower running costs. It's cheaper to use a fuel-efficient car. So we drive further and more often, or we get 2 of them or 3 of them because we can afford it, right? More energy. The fuel-efficient car has lower petroleum bills. We don't take that money and just like throw it away, like, hey, we didn't have to spend it on gasoline. We're not going to use that money. We use it on something else. In high-income countries, all the data shows that we use it on increasingly energy-intensive lifestyles. So we get more energy use. So efficiency has led to more energy use. It's what's called Jevons paradox, or the rebound effect, right? You think you're making progress, but the rebound effect of energy efficiency makes everything cheaper, so therefore we use more of it. Okay, and I'll come back to this other arrow of embodied energy, right? Because all the things we produce to substitute for one energy type for another still requires energy to make it. And when those energy surplus are squeezed, there's less and less energy available to make this stuff. Okay, John, all right. But the economy can grow without more resources from our waste through substitution. Okay? And that was at the basis of the Robert Solow quote that I put up, right? That market economies provide incentives, right? That scarcity sends price signals to entrepreneurs. That entrepreneurs then develop substitutes for things that we used to use that we're running out of to things that we have lots of, right? We move from a fossil fueled economy to a renewably powered economy, and we can keep the growth dream alive. Substitution. Well, we explain substitution, right, in the pizza example, right? I don't know why economics authors chose pizza as their primary example, but there's always a pizza example, right? And there's the labor of the chef, right? There's the capital of the pizza oven, and then there's the ingredients of the dough and the tomatoes, and then they never mention, but I'll mention the energy to run the whole thing, okay? Energy and matter to create a pizza, I hope you would agree, are complementary to everything else. You can add more chefs and create more pizza. You can add a bigger oven and create a more efficient oven and create more pizza, right? But you always and everywhere, guess what you need? Energy and matter, right? Energy and matter, and this low entropy energy matter, right? The gold of fossil fuels is always and everywhere complementary to the economic process. Ugh. Substitution ain't gonna work. It helps us get through binds and get through sort of relative scarcity or bottlenecks, right? But ultimately, substitution falls apart. And this is what's happening. This is a graphic from a colleague, Tim Jackson, an economist in the UK, who's done a lot of work on thinking about, can we have prosperity without growth? And he's plotted here the energy return on energy invested in Canada, okay? Until recently, we imported a lot of our energy from Canada. Okay, Canada and Mexico, two of the big energy exporters, still to this day. And as we climb this graph, we see that through technology, through capital investment, through education, right, through new engineers, we found ways, right, to get to higher and higher and higher energy return on investment. That's what that y-axis is. Higher and higher energy returns on investment. Until a point. And then it crashes. And then we get smart and apply new technologies, new capital, right? Like fracking has enabled us to go back to depleted wells and squeeze what's left in the rock, right? So we climb the energy return on investment and to a point. And so what we're doing now is that we're substituting these high energy return fuels for lower and lower and lower energy return fuels. This is dramatically putting the brakes on growth, whether we like it or not.
Can you tell us the years on that?
Sure, that is from 1940 to 2010.
What's the peak?
The peak year is 72, 73. So we see the peak in all of these kinds of graphs. That was the peak year for all the lower 48 oil for the US, was also that time period. Late 60s, early 70s, right before the oil crisis years, right? When we got over that peak, Middle East knew it. They put the squeeze on us, changed the whole situation, right? So what did we do? We went to Alaska, and we extended the peak even further, right? The US has since crashed that peak. What did we do? We cranked the technology arm. We went back to old wells. What do we do now? Instead of going about 100 feet below the ground in Pennsylvania, those early wells, we go something on the order of, I wrote it down here, 35,000 feet was the deep water horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. We're dropping through the ocean, and then drilling through the crust of the earth. First few oil wells in Pennsylvania, 70 feet. Deepwater Horizon, 35,000 feet. Physics, gang, it takes a lot more energy to get that oil than just poking a hole in some farm field in Pennsylvania. Does that make sense? This is that showing that graph for Canada where we've got really, really good numbers. Renewable energy. What's along the left there is from on the top, hydro, coal, world oil production, oil exports in 1990, oil and gas in 1970, then to wind, then to oil imports in 2005, and then oil imports in 2007, and then nuclear, then photovoltaics, then shale oil. As we get down farther, we've got biodiesel there at the very, very end, which is barely above 1-to-1, right? So these are energy return on energy investment. As we move away from coal and oil towards lower quality coal and oil, but as we move away from coal and oil from fossil fuels to renewables, right? EROI, the number I'm saying is the magic economy. Okay, so this is what's going on as we grow the service sectors in the economy, and that yellow is our finance, insurance, real estate, rental, leasing, right? That's a big part of the service sector economy that's growing in our country. It is leading to more energy use, not less. Okay, the graphs that I love, and I'm sorry, I'm an energy geek, are these Sankey diagrams. Have you ever seen these? I freaking love these things, right? Because it starts with all the sources and all the use, and it shows you both the waste and the end use flowing through the US economy. Lawrence Livermore National Lab does these every year. The latest one is 2018. And in their latest one, their conclusion was that the United States of America consumes 101.2 quads, the most energy we've ever consumed. Yet we're becoming more and more and more of a service sector, right? I'll get to land in a minute. Jim's like, I know energy, okay, but land, what about land? Right? US energy use is the highest levels ever. 101.2 quads is the equivalent to 810 billion gallons of gasoline. If you put a human being on an exercise cycle for 8 hours a day and measure how many kilowatt hours that human being can produce, okay? Each of us today, on average, in the United States of America, has 415 human beings working for us from all that energy. It's pretty cool, huh? Did you know that? If you're an average American, and you guys look above average to me. Average American, you have 450 people working 8 hours a day for you in energy terms. In a service sector economy. Remember that. Land. If you didn't see this, you've got to check it out. Bloomberg, 2 years ago, July 31st, 2018, took the latest USDA land cover data, and they plotted out the lower 48. Each of these squares is 250,000 acres of land, and they just sort of said, what's the dominant use for that particular square? Okay? So you see up here in the Northeast, a lot of forests. Over there in the Adirondacks, a lot of blue, special use, which includes parks. Right? So you got pasture rangeland, forest land, cropland, special use, military bases, golf courses, parks, wilderness areas, miscellaneous, mines, roads, a whole bunch of stuff, and then all the urban uses. So if you take all those squares and just sort of sort them, this is how much pasture rangeland the United States uses. Okay, that by far the most dominant use. Forest, cropland, the special use, and I'll break that up a little bit more for you in a second, miscellaneous, and then urban. Where, by the way, most people live in urban, right? We are an urban country now. If you didn't know, 85% of Americans live in urban places. Got plenty of space to grow, right? What's the fastest land use category of growth? Urban use, especially suburban use, right? That's where the growth is. The only thing faster is, I love how they use Florida for this. This is land of the 100 largest landowners in the country. 100 largest landowners make up the space equivalent to Florida. That's the #1 fastest growing land use in the country right now by big, big landowners. In the middle there is cows on pasture and rangeland. Up in the right-hand corner there is rural housing, urban commercial, urban housing. That's the second fastest growing area outside of rich landowners. I wish we had a bigger screen for you, but there's everything is cool stuff in there, like golf courses and airports and roads. Much of the U.S. land serves very specific purposes, such as the 2 million acres devoted now to golf course, another growing land use. 3 million acres now devoted to airports. And like I said, the recent statistic, since 2008, the amount of land owned by the 100 largest private landowners has grown from 28 million acres to 40 million acres since 2008. And that's the fastest growing land use in this categorization. We're service sector. We're not going to consume more land. Just the opposite is true. Okay, the last one. But the economy can grow without more resources or more waste through cost shifting. There are benefits to growth and there are costs to growth. And to keep the growth model alive, especially in rich countries, we shift the costs of growth onto other people, other generations, and other species. This one's true. You can keep the growth model going by shifting costs. That's the only thing that's keeping the growth model alive right now. We call this in economics market failures, right? If the market doesn't account for all the costs of an economic activity, right? The so-called social costs or environmental costs of growth, well, then we just have to figure out how to regulate those costs or price those costs and bring them into the market system and everything will be fine, right? No problem. Market can fix market failures. Ecological economics points out that no, cost shifting is not market failure. It's a market feature. The capitalism system does not work, cannot work without shifting costs. Okay, capitalism and colonialism have gone hand in hand for a reason, right? And the growing environmental costs are occurring because that's what the system needs to perpetuate itself. End of story. Growth is fueled by the extraction of these surpluses, by exploiting people, by exploiting government, and by exploiting the environment. And full internalization, what we talk about in economics, right? We can internalize these costs. Any honest assessment of full internalization of the ecological cost, the social cost, the carbon cost, would bring growth to an end. It's not a market failure, it's a market feature. Okay? I can give you thousands of examples. I'll give you two. Great book out by Raj Patel, The Value of Nothing. He went through the math of calculating the social and ecological true cost of a McDonald's hamburger. Any numbers out there? Shout it out. You can get a McDonald's burger for what? I don't know, $1 or $2?
$26.80.
$26.80. $43.21. Any higher estimates? It's like Price is Right. 75. Higher? 99. Higher? All right, lower. $200. That's what you would have to pay to buy a McDonald's hamburger if you paid for the true cost of that burger. $200. Will the growth model work at $200 burgers? I don't know. All right, so let's do this for the world instead of just one company. A company called True Costs that one of my graduate students helped found, based out of the UK. They did this report a few years back called Natural Capital at Risk. They went and sort of tried to do a tally, right, of all of the primary sectors in particular, right, the energy and matter that makes the secondary sectors, the tertiary sectors, the service sector work are all possible, remember, because of the ag surplus, energy surplus, right? So they said, all right, this is what undergirds the growth system. What are the true costs of that? So they added up the costs from greenhouse gas emissions, water use, land use, air pollution, land and water pollution, solid waste, including hazardous, non-hazardous, nuclear, right? And they did this analysis of 1,000 global primary production sort of industry regions. They did this by region. All of those primary producers, those 1,000 of them, are responsible for about 13% of the global economy, global GDP. That sits at the basis, right, of manufacturing, at the basis of the service sector, of the basis of higher education, everything, right, requires that 13% to make everything else possible. None of the top 20 region sectors would be profitable if they incorporated the full costs, so-called externalities, right? The top, and then this is important to note too, the top 100 of these sectors, regional sectors, so like the coal sector in the United States, right? Or the dairy farming sector in the Northeast, right? None of the top 100, the top 100 account for, you gotta really, if you've nodded off, pay attention for a second, okay? The concentration of the impact is a really important thing. Top 100 account for 85% of the land use impact, 92% of the water use impact, 87% of the greenhouse gas impact, 81% of air pollution impact, 86% of land and water, and 99% of the waste impact come from that top 100. So you look at that top 100, which is at the base of everything else, so you can't take the service sector off the hook, because the service sector doesn't work without the primary sector, right? That's where it is. That's where the impact is. It trickles through the rest of the economy. So they created a big model called an input-output model, extended input-output model work that I do. And they sort of connected the dots to both the impacts, the depletion, and the degradation. And they found that this base of the economic pyramid would go bankrupt if you charged it for its true cost. Okay, so how do we do it? Check. Resource exhaustion is an event, not a catastrophe. Myth? No? Reality? No. Okay, how about green growth? Green growth can solve the climate crisis. All right, lots and lots of this. The green growth is kind of the new fairy tale of our time, really since the 1987 Brundtland Report, the Our Common Future Report, which really sort of coined or really defined this idea of sustainable development. The Brundtland Commission, the Sustainable Development Goals now that we're committed to by over 190 countries in 2015. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD countries, the United Nations Environmental Program, the World Bank, basically the entire UN infrastructure, right, is depending on green growth to get us to our climate targets in particular. Emission scenarios that are put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change all assume, across the board, 3% annual GDP growth for the world. Okay? That's the growth in my lifetime. Remember, I just turned 50. Last November. In my lifetime, we've been averaging about 3% GDP growth for the planet. That has quadrupled the size of the world economy. Okay? So that's the expectation under the IPCC scenario. So we can't get off growth. That's the unquestioned assumption, right? They don't even like do sensitivity analysis. Well, what if we had smaller growth or zero growth or negative? No. That's not allowed. 3% GDP. Okay? Of course, our current federal administration is this delusion of 4%. I don't know what the numbers are they float, but we've been hitting 2.5. I think we hit 3.1% in one quarter recently. Global economy will be 4 times the size in 50 years under 3% growth. I mentioned that in my lifetime, under 3% growth, we've lost half the number of wild animals on the planet. A whole other UN study predicts that under these kinds of growth, by the end of the century, we won't just lose numbers of species, we will lose 1 million species will be extinct under that growth scenario by the end of the century. But IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we all like to cite, I do it myself, right? The global consensus on climate change, at 3% growth per year, says that we can hit our targets, right? You know our targets? 2 degrees Celsius is what the world's governments have agreed to. We'd like to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we can. 2 degrees Celsius is what we're agreed to. That's what the Paris Agreement is built on, even though all the commitments on the Paris Agreement won't get to 2 degrees, but that's another story. We get to 2 degrees under growth scenarios by decoupling, efficiency, green growth, right? We decouple the economy from the environment. I know it's the day after Valentine's Day. I'm not talking about like decoupling, like breaking up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, right? Decoupling is breaking the growth from its impacts and its resources. The arrows in and out of my box, right? Okay, so this is the graph from the UN Environmental Program that lays out decoupling natural resource use and environmental impacts from economic growth, the name of the report. This is the sort of philosophy of meeting the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Human well-being is the top graph. That'll continue to grow exponentially. Economic activity is the next one. It'll continue to grow exponentially. Resource decoupling, right? The matter, the materials, the matter and energy, the in arrows will break from economic activity, right? Relative decoupling says you break, but you don't go like this. You sort of grow at a rate less than the economic system. So that's the red graph and the blue graph. And then impact decoupling, which is what the IPCC scenarios assume, right? Is that we can grow the economy, grow human well-being, and run greenhouse gas emissions the other way, under 3% annual growth per year. With zero evidence that we've ever done that before, right? But if we just get the incentives right and do the shift to these lower and lower EROI fuels, we can do it without ever questioning the machine, the engine of the growth model. Great paper that I sent to Jim by Jason Hickel from the UK and Professor Callas from Barcelona, Spain. 2 amazing writers who are right in the thick of thinking through an honest assessment of whether green growth is possible. What this plots is the red graph. So, well, first of all, the blue graph is GDP, gross domestic product, for the US, for 27 nations in the EU, and for the larger group of rich nations called the OECD on the right. Okay, US, EU, OECD. The blue graph is GDP, growing from 1990 out through 2010. The red graph is what's called domestic material consumption. This is what governments report. Okay, take the total weight, actual weight, tonnage, right, of national raw materials extracted from within your borders, plus what you import, minus what you export, and that's the material basis of your consumption, right? That undergirths. And so that's the red graph. And you say, hey, look, we're decoupling, right? The blue graph's continuing to grow, and the red graph is like this graph, right? The red graph in this one is growing, and the blue graph is growing, but not as fast. So domestic material consumption says that that's true. However, we've grown, we continue to grow our consumption despite our dematerialization of our in-country production. Does that make sense? Let me explain this. Well, let me explain this with the green graph. If you calculate the material footprint, okay, this is how much matter and energy is required to support our consumption, right? That's the total resource impact of consumption by nation. There is zero evidence of decoupling. How have we continued to grow? By using less resources in this country because we're using somebody else's resources to grow. So as a planet, the math doesn't add up, and here it is as a planet. Here's the global material footprint from 1970 to 2013. And that graph on the right is global GDP against global material footprint. So the rich countries are running around saying, we are decoupling, we're dematerializing, right? We're doing that through trade. Remember how much trade has grown? Remember how much foreign direct investment has grown? Right? At planetary scales, there is no evidence of decoupling. If you go all the way back to 1900, global extraction and consumption of materials has increased 8-fold, right? There's in fact evidence in the last decade that it's speeding up. Why? Because of a wealth effect, right? As poorer countries have become middle-income countries, and as middle-income countries have become high-income countries, guess what they do? They use more resources, right? Remember the rebound effect. More efficient resources, but more resources. This is a challenge to the growth model. So the other piece here, impact decoupling. So this is what IPCC assumes, right? That we can grow the economy at 3% per year, and we can decouple from its impact, right? So growth becomes compatible with the Paris Agreement. The challenge with the Paris Agreement, or more aggressive agreements to actually get to 2 degrees Celsius, is it means that we have a fixed carbon budget left to burn through. You've probably heard this, right? There's a fixed carbon budget that's left to burn through. The Carbon Tracker Initiative has done this really well. They go around the world and they sort of see, well, they first take the scientific consensus and say how much carbon is left that we can burn through to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Then they go around the world and they say how much carbon is on the books of our national energy companies and our private energy companies. And then they go around the world and they realize that trillions and trillions of dollars are being invested in new exploration, new technology, new ways to get fossil fuels. And they realize that, the amount of energy that's on the books is many more times than the carbon allowable burn. And then they realize that investments in oil, coal, natural gas, exploration, extraction, and transport have averaged in this last decade $1 trillion a year. And then they look at the International Energy Agency's projections of new investments, and they realize that out to 2040, there's going to be an additional $20 trillion in the pipeline already to invest in new extraction, new exploration of fossil fuels. And then they say, our carbon budget is way below what's actually out there that's burnable carbon. So can we carbon decouple? Well, again, it depends on if you do this by a state or a country or the world. For carbon, the only scale that matters is the world, right? And the right graph there is global CO2 emissions, right? We just hit another record last year of global CO2 emissions, or at least early estimates. We see a country like the US is decoupling, but it's getting more and more of its carbon emissions from abroad through our consumption. Or the EU is decoupling, but it's getting more and more of its carbon emissions abroad from its consumption. There's the hope that China has peaked, right, and flattened, but India and sub-Saharan Africa and much of Latin America is right behind to sort of fill the void. So this is a challenge. This is just a prop. This is carbon mitigation that would be required. The early graphs, you said this is a pointer, right? The early graphs here are if we had sort of got our act together and started to decline to stay within the carbon budget, to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. But here, now we're here. It's a pretty damn dramatic task, right? To decarbonate while we grow at 3% a year, right? And this is the more modest effort of getting to 2 degrees. Green growth, optimism. So these are all the IPCC scenarios plotted here. All the IPCC scenarios. And a lot of them, the scenarios get us to 1.5 degrees, and even more of them get us to 2 degrees. Oh, how the heck did they do this at 3% growth? You got to look under the hood, man. Right? Technology. They crank up renewables, of course, but they also crank up this thing called BECCS. IPCC 5th annual assessment, 116 mitigation scenarios with a chance of, they do 50-50 odds, with a chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. All stabilize emissions by growing GDP. My question, of course, and the theme of this talk, is this a fairy tale? Nearly all rely on BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Yet there's only one demonstration project at scale doing this. To actually get to a system where we get negative emissions, okay, by harvesting and burning wood for energy and then capturing those CO2 emissions on site and sinking them into the ground, that's what's assumed under all these scenarios. You'd have to have large tree plantations, back to land, Jim, 1 to 2 times the size of India. By 2040. Not just plant it, but plant it, burn it, sink it on site. What kind of freaking fantasy world are we living in? This is a huge, huge controversy within the climate science community, right? This assumption that makes each of these optimistic scenarios work. If you look at decoupling studies, which our colleagues Jason Hickel and Professor Callis have done in this article that just came out last year, all of these decoupling studies that they reviewed, every single one of them, right, doesn't allow for slow growth, no growth, or degrowth, right? They all assume that we have to continue growing. And they go through great lengths to get to the 2 degrees Celsius, right, by assuming crazy assumptions on technological improvements. If GDP grows at 3% a year, at a minimum, then decoupling will require 7.3% a year, which is about 7 times faster than it ever has been in the history of the world. This is a challenge. So Donella Meadows said it best, Dartmouth professor, one of the lead authors of the 1972 Limits to Growth study. She said, growth has costs as well as benefits, and we typically don't count the costs, among which are poverty and hunger, environmental destruction, and so on. The whole list of problems that we are trying to solve with growth, what is needed is much slower growth. Very different kinds of growth, and in some cases, no growth or negative growth. The world's leaders are correctly fixated on economic growth as the answer to virtually all problems, but they're pushing it with all their might in the wrong direction. Right? The wisdom of Donella Meadows. Okay, check. Green growth can solve the climate process. Fact or fiction? Myth or reality? There's a lot of optimism built into these models. Chris, you took off your optimism button. Okay. Sorry. Part 2, realities of the Anthropocene, and then we'll really roll our sleeves up and think about how can we do degrowth by design. First, degrowth by default, and you're probably already getting a sense that there's a lot of doubts out there that the growth model can continue, will continue. And the real challenge is that if we assume that it will continue and hit limits willy-nilly, a lot of people are going to get hurt. A lot of vulnerable people are going to get hurt, right? Whereas if we have an opportunity to make the transition, make the transformation, get off of our growth addiction, maybe we could do this in a way where well-being is broadly shared and maintained. Is it possible? My parents' lives haven't been all that bad. When they had me in 1969, they had way less per capita consumption, right? Way less income, way less everything, and they lived in a world with half as many people. So, this is the system we're in, the Anthropocene, okay, where we're taking every last little bit of space if we can do it. Back to that Tim Jackson article. So this is the growth rate in the Rich Country Club, OECD, per capita GDP, from 1966 to 2016. '66 actually is the year of peak GDP growth for our country. We've never hit that rate since. You can see the trend. Okay, he's plotted this in a moving trend, an average trend, a year-to-year trend, but the trend of the rich countries' growth is going down, 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 down. This is labor productivity growth. Labor productivity continues to increase, but the growth rate is in precipitous decline. Okay, each new unit of labor is making less in growth terms than the last unit. Okay, making more, but the growth rate is slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. It's in precipitous decline. Any Senator Sanders fans out there? I heard you said 1%. There we go. Thank you. All right. Come on, we're in Vermont. We know the story, right? So it's going like, so the gains, the payment to the inputs of production have to, if it's not going to wage, where's it going? It's going to profits, going to interest. It's going to the capital class, right? This is what's making the model continue to work. And as a result, the post-income tax shares of the top 10% and top 1% in the US from 1935 to 2015 looks something like this. And it's even worse in 2019. Okay? The red graph is the 1%, and the blue graph is the top 10%. So we know where it's going. And just to bring this home, this is the post-tax income growth in the US by percentile. And that little dot on the top there is the 0.001%, the top red dot, right? Whereas everyone else is losing ground, and the middle income, low income groups are losing ground, and the rich countries or the rich people, households are gaining ground. Debt is a big part of the story here, which is really important, because again, since the 70s, early 80s, we've kept the growth machine alive by issuing more and more forms of credit. Not just government debt, right, but a lot of private debt. This is outstanding domestic credit versus US GDP from 1951 to 2014. A graph by a former PhD student of mine, Nate Higgins, who's done a lot of great work on this in an article that just came out last month. So this is showing the economy growing in green, but the debt growing to 150% the size of the economy, 250%, 350% the size of the economy. Okay, ready? Pop quiz. How do you pay debt off? Let other people pay it. If you're going to pay it, if your country's going to pay it, you've got to grow, right? So debt is nothing more than a claim on future resources. Future land, future air, future water, future energy. Okay? The growth model is built on decreasing energy return on investment. So to sort of substitute for that, we've had to substitute with debt. And what happens is, these are Nate's graphs, two hypothetical graphs of an oil field production with no debt and an oil field production with debt. Is debt actually accelerates depletion, right? Because now you got to get more out of the ground to pay the interest, right? So it accelerates. So this accelerating debt curve is accelerating not only claims on the future, but current depletion and pollution. In this graph, I'm teasing this out right now with a grad student of mine, Rigo Melgar, is GDP per unit debt. And that's in precipitous decline. It used to be that we borrowed some money and we got a lot of GDP out of it. We borrowed money, the capitalist system put it in productive investments, we cranked the growth even more, right? But look at that decline. GDP per unit debt is down, 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 down. We're getting desperate, gang. We're getting desperate. So Thomas Friedman, around the time of the Great Recession, well, on the heels of the Great Recession, wrote this piece in the New York Times, The Inflection in Europe, real kind of mainstream fellow, right? And he wrote, what if the crisis of 2008 represents something much more fundamental than a deep recession? What if it's telling us that the whole growth model we created over the last 50 years is simply unsustainable economically and ecologically, and that 2008 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said no more. He was wrong on the economic side, right? Because we've kept the growth model alive through debt. More debt. And he was right on the ecological side, as we've hit all-time levels of energy, all-time levels of CO2 emissions, all-time levels of land depletion, pollution. You pick the statistic, you pick the hockey stick diagram, we're continuing to do what we've always done. Okay, so that's my argument for degrowth by default, right? We're gonna, like at some point, we're not gonna pay off the debt, or the system's gonna fall under its own weight, or I know we've been saying this for a long time. We found creative ways through substitution, through efficiency to kind of keep the growth model going. The latest way has been through massive global debt. So the last piece of this is degrowth by design. The positive part of the talk. Okay? Can we do this? Can we degrow if we tackle it head on and stop this BS fairy tale that growth that caused all the problems will solve all the problems? Can we get politicians to stand up at a stump and call for a steady state economy in Vermont? Whew. You guys would be out of a job quick, wouldn't you? Okay, so here we go. First question is this true? Are we seeing do we see human well-being increase with economic activity, or actually, is that BS? I know I'm in a church here, I gotta watch my language. I can use initials, right? Decoupling of human well-being from GDP is actually perhaps the more accurate story. We've done a lot of work here in this state on what's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. That's kind of an initial attempt at trying to get at this. It's got a long history of this kind of work in the US, and it's pointed to this idea of uneconomic growth. You won't find that phrase in any economics textbook. It comes from ecological economics, right? That next benefit of growth isn't as much as the next cost. Why would you do it? Uneconomic growth, right? So the Genuine Progress Indicator tracks against GDP, right? And for the US, our GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, peaked in the mid-70s period and has been flat or in decline ever since. So you won't see all the details here, but it's made up of 25 different indicators. It includes the social costs and benefits of growth, the environmental costs and benefits of growth, and the economic costs and benefits of growth. It takes that consumption, which is the biggest part of GDP, okay? 85% of GDP is just pure household consumption, in one box and out the other in a year time period, right? Not investment, not durables, but all that stuff that we just burn through. And it says, okay, that has something to do with our well-being, right? We have to consume to have livelihoods. And then it sort of subtracts out the costs of that consumption, like air pollution, water pollution, land degradation, forest conversion, ag loss, et cetera, et cetera. It subtracts out some of the social costs, like loss of time. It recognizes that there are underemployed people in our economy. That's a cost, but there are also overemployed people in our economy that have lost time that they wish they had for leisure, with family, with community, right? So it does that kind of time use balancing and an end use balancing on the environmental side. And it's been done for upwards of 30 countries now. And you won't see all these details, but this is Australia, Austria, Belgium, China, Chile, and Germany. Same story. Growth, peak of GPI in the late 70s. This is India, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland. Same story. Growth, peak of genuine progress in the late 70s. This is Sweden, Thailand, UK, United States, and Vietnam. Same story. Growth, peak. Some of them, the peak came a little later, like the Scandinavian countries, like Sweden, were able to push out that peak progress, if you will, a little later, but they're all in decline. And so, Ida Kubaszewski, PhD grad from the Gund Institute at UVM, and colleagues put together kind of an assessment of all the numbers out there globally, and they kind of came up with the conclusion that we've been in a progress recession as a globe for some time now. We've been in an era of an economic growth. We are growing because we're on this treadmill, right? Because we have to. But the costs of that growth have been greater than its benefits for some time. So we tried to get a handle on this a little bit here in Vermont. A few years back, we passed the Vermont Act 113 to develop the Genuine Progress Indicator, to use it to compare against our gross state product, right? It was incorporated on the Shumlin administration in a comprehensive economic strategy for the state. It's meant to sort of aid in decision-making processes, right? It's a challenging indicator to do because honestly, we don't have timely data for it. It's largely been an academic exercise that we're trying to bring into the policy space. It's like the 1940s all over again when we didn't have GDP, right? So Roosevelt said, go forth and create GDP, and they did. No one has yet said, go forth and collect all the data that we need for GPI. So this is Vermont's gross state product versus our GPI per capita. Same story here, right? Our mean gross state product per capita is growing along there at 2.2% a year. It creates higher and higher material lifestyles for the average Vermonter. But our GPI, while it's continued to grow farther out than the US GPI, it has peaked, and in our latest studies is down even farther. This at 2011 was at minus 43%, now it's closer to 57%. How is this working? Well, the economic one is sort of substituting for, if you will, the loss in the social one, the second from the bottom, and the loss of the environmental one, the one on the bottom. Negative costs of the environment, declining cost-benefit ratio for social. The economy in Vermont continues to grow, so it sort of subsidizes, right? Makes us think, hey, we got a job. Yeah, I'm working 3 jobs to pay the bills, but yeah, I got a job, right? So we lost in social values, lost in environmental values. There's lots of other ways to think about this. The U.S. General Social Survey has been done in the U.S. and around the world for a long time. Taken all together, the questions asked, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are not happy, pretty happy, or very happy? So this is data going all the way back to 1972 through 2008. Same story, right? Blue graph, growth. Red graph, reported happiness, flat. My parents' generation, just as happy as my generation, yet I got four times more stuff. On average, I got probably way more than the average, right? Right? Follow me? What the heck are we doing? So think of that flat happiness graph, the red line, and I threw this in for you last night, Jim. Housing, right? The red graph is the average household size, which was about 3 persons per household in 1973, down to about 2.5 people per household now, so less people per home. But the dark blue graph going up is the average house size, and the light blue graph is the median house size. In 2014, the average size of new homes built, was at an all-time high of 2,700 square feet. That is up from 1,000 square feet, less than 1,000 square feet when I was born. Okay? And by my calculation, it hasn't made us any happier. Bigger houses, more rooms per person, right? A friend of mine was telling me they were at a house the other day and there was a television in the freaking toilet, in the kitchen, in the living room, in the bedroom. Okay, so a lot of work on how to design, like one thing is change the indicator, right? Let's get an actual sense of well-being instead of this propped up sense of well-being comes only from material consumption. There's a whole bunch of playbooks out there. Prosperity Without Growth by Tim Jackson, who I've mentioned. Our own Bill McKibben on deep economy. Peter Victor, a colleague in Toronto, who's worked a lot on modeling the Canadian economy in a way that would maintain full employment but degrow the economy. A book called Managing Without Growth. Juliet Shore's work from Boston University on true wealth. Like, what if we counted what true wealth was? And this book by Kate Raworth, an Oxford economist, is getting a lot of attention, called Donut Economics, right? It really tries to make the case that there's a social foundation to our economies, and an ecological ceiling. And the 21st century economist has to think about how to get to the sweet spot, not blow past the ecological ceilings. So a smooth economic downscaling to a sustainable future where we can live better with less is a quote from Professor Callas from Barcelona, who's one of the preeminent degrowth scholars right now. This is what he defines as sustainable degrowth. Sustainable degrowth. And some ideas from his scholarship and others from the degrowth community, right? We're hosting a degrowth festival here as part of US Degrow Network in August, actually up at UVM, at Burlington more broadly. And some of the ideas from that scholarship include work sharing to redistribute gains from productivity. I was really horrified to see that the paid family leave bill was first vetoed by our governor and then not overturned by one vote in the House. Progressive taxes on capital and off labor to reconnect wages to productivity, right? So we're doing the opposite, right? More of the tax burden goes on wage and off of capital. That's why we get that dot way up in the top corner there of 0.001%, the highest growth, because that's income from capital, not income from wages. Tax shift to disincentivize resource-intensive consumption, right? We've got to stop taxing things we want and not tax things that we don't. And we can do this in a tax shift way. We can do this in an intelligent way. We can do this where the most vulnerable in our society are held harmless. And these are really transition strategies. None of these are silver bullets by themselves. And reforming the monetary system to reduce the growth bias. Inherent in our current money system is growth. It doesn't work without growth. Plain and simple. And it creates a growth bias as it goes, right? As we put money into existence through the private banking system, instead of spending money into existence through, green infrastructure, Green New Deal, all these ideas of spending money into existence, not through consumption, not through tax breaks, not through low interest loans to further supercharge consumption, but through investments in a degrowth economy. This was out late last year, a book on the triumph of injustice, how the rich dodge taxes and how to make them pay. It's covered in the New York Times. This graph is actually pulled from the Times. So this is lower income groups to the left, high income groups to the right. This is the total tax rate when you go through the trouble of adding up federal, state, and local all together. Looked pretty darn progressive in 1950, right? Around the time when my folks were born. Look at it now. Are the wealthiest amongst us paying our fair share? For the first time in history, right? In recent years, we've seen, when you take the whole tax system together, a regressive tax system. Okay, where the wealthiest are paying less, much less than their fair share. So you look back to the GPI idea. Market economies, market economics of growth, you've all heard this saying before as well, right? Indeed are privatizing the benefits and socializing the costs. All of the costs in the GPI dial we all share, right? We share in declining water quality of Lake Champlain. We all pay that cost, right? But the few who get to impose that cost get to reap the benefits. Right? We all share in depletion of energy resources. Right? But the few that get to capture the dollars from that fossil fuel depletion get to keep the benefits. So we know that this is what the system was designed to do. Under degrowth by design, a lot of great work is happening about how can we maintain full employment by time shifting, time sharing, time valuing, actually valuing non-market activities, right? Valuing household work, valuing care work, valuing time in your community, right? And creating the space for those kinds of values. It's not that we don't have to stop growing, and quality of life. We just have to stop growing in the quantity of life, right? The consumptive quantities. And under degrowth by design, the thing to get started on right away is the reduction in these massive social inequalities that we haven't seen since the few years before the Great Depression. This would improve well-being across the board and address the climate crisis. Here's a number from that graph from that great book by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level, out in 2001, where they sort of assessed all of the social and health, environmental dimensions of inequality. And so what this graph shows you is low income inequality on the left, countries with high income inequality on the right, and that dot in the top right corner there is the USA. And then this is their index from worse to better, better on the bottom, worse on the top. And this is the index of health and social problems. And so they went through and looked at life expectancy, math and reading literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, social mobility. The countries with the worst inequality also have all the other crap. That shouldn't be a surprise, right? And one of their main points was actually a more equal society helps us all. Even if your motto is Gordon Gekko's greed is good, you do better in a more equal society. The CO2 emissions part, this is a recently published analysis looking at global greenhouse gas emissions driven by US households. I already told you the trade part of the story. When you hear that we're decoupling from CO2 emissions, it is a myth, because you have to look at the CO2 emissions that are created from our consumption. Upwards of 20 to 30% of our CO2 emissions come from imports. The CO2 is emitted someplace else, but it's created because of our consumption. You follow me? So this is looking at by income class, less than 5,000 on the top there, above 150,000 or more on the bottom. And you get this kind of exponential rate, right? More intensive CO2 lifestyles, the richer we get. Okay, so like the yellow bar is transportation. More and more CO2 from transportation, not because the rich are driving more, but because we're flying more, right? So if you think about squishing these social inequalities, you also get an amazing run to the middle for our CO2 emissions. So inequality is really, there's no silver bullets out there. I think Bill McKibben said there's silver buckshot, right? This is one of the pebbles in the silver buckshot. Growth by design at bioregional scales. Like, what can we do in my community of Ferrisburg, or in UVM's community of Burlington, or our community of Vermont, right? While we're waiting for these larger system changes to happen, either by default or by design. It's really not rocket science, I'm sorry, but planning. The P word. We have to plan. We have to do good, comprehensive planning, right? We have to think about planning for slowing growth. We've called it for a long time smart growth, but that's the kind of green growth idea, right? But we have to do comprehensive planning, master planning at the local level, right, in Vermont. Not just zoning, but planning. Where do we want things to go? How do we want things to be? When that old dilapidated house could just be renovated and repaired and put in the use of a low-income family, why do we have to build that new one over there, right? How do we plan comprehensively for a joint energy, water, food system? How do we plan around, we've talked a long time about watersheds. Vermont is really pushing the conversation about food sheds. We now got to start really thinking about energy sheds, right? How do we plan? How do we become energy grid owners instead of rate payers, right? That would go a long way around getting rid of NIMBYism in this state, right? How do we sort of become part of the transformation that we want to see? It's not going to happen through the sort of magic forces of the market. It's going to happen from people getting together in rooms like this all over Vermont and planning. Recirculating income. There's a lot of great work to think about communities, the revenues and costs of a community as a leaky bucket. Okay? Some of this work comes from Michael Kinsley at the Rocky Mountain Institute. This image of a leaky bucket, right? So our communities leak out dollars all the time, right? When we have inefficient buildings, right? And we're really good at this in Vermont with our old building stock of heating the outdoors. Maybe some of you do it, right? That money, especially if it's heat through fossil fuels or even heat through wood, right, is money wasted. Is money that could be recirculated within your economy. That's a big, big leak that can be plugged in our bucket. Instead, we want to change zoning laws. We want to use subsidies, right? We want to do handshake deals, right? We want to bring jobs into our community instead of keep the ones we have, right? We want to fill the bucket with more revenue sources instead of plugging the leaks in the bucket, right? Fantastic work out there that shows cost to community services, right? Especially in rural communities and in suburban communities. Each new unit of growth, each new housing lot that's developed creates less tax revenue than it costs the taxpayer. Degrowth. That's uneconomic growth, not economic growth. So coming to terms with that is a big part. Common assets, right? Owning things, or better yet, stewarding things as trusts, our land, our water, our air. Okay, we've got great traditions in this state of land trusts, right? Maybe less participation of broader segments of our community than I'd like to see, but the vehicles of land trusts or community land trusts is really the gold standard, right? Or community-owned energy systems is the gold standard, right? These are things that help us bring the scale of the system back into the aspirations of what it is to have a good life. Land value taxes. Separating the tax of the land versus the building, right? This has been around since Henry George's time, right? The best-selling book in the 1890s was a book by Henry George, right? Called Poverty and Progress. Did I get that right? Really sort of thinking about land taxation as one of the main mechanisms for consolidating development instead of spreading it out. Shared ownership of capital, shared ownership of business. Another thing we can be proud about here in Vermont is really taking the lead on employee-owned companies, right? And moving to that next phase of community-owned companies, right? Because if you can see the impact of your investment dollars in your backyard, you will make different decisions. Whereas if it comes in your quarterly statement, in your retirement plan, Chris, you and I have talked about this. How do we create opportunities for investment in Vermont that you can see instead of investments far away that you see but only on this piece of paper that comes once a quarter? And you have no agency whatsoever to influence those decisions. And community-based bonds, community-based ways of investing. I mean, we do this through schools, but we need to think beyond just school bonds, right? What was the name of your bond that you were floating?
Freedom and Unity bonds.
Freedom and Unity bonds, right? Leaning into our state's model, right? Thinking about ways to keep some of those investment dollars local and build infrastructure, build productive capacity, not have our money just go to consumption. So, those are some thoughts that I thought I'd seed a conversation with, half-an-hour conversation with, on degrowth by design. And I'd love to see what we can accomplish here in the next 30 minutes. Thank you.